Every headline is not just information, it's a window into our moral world. In today's episode, we take three stories from the news of September 2025. Each story forces us to ask what happens when institutions, that is, political, legal, and corporate, face ethical failure. First up is the case of Rajasthan Assembly, where surveillance cameras were installed. And assembly members start asking this question: is this security or a breach of democratic trust? The second case is of custodial torture, an issue which serves as a reminder that when state abandons restraint, justice itself collapses. And the last case comes from corporate world. Recently, Nestle's CEO was forced to resign over a personal choice. A personal choice that turned into a global corporate scandal. Together, these cases span politics, policing, and business. Three worlds, one thread: how power tests ethics and how ethics tests power. So let's get started. Last month, newspapers reported protests inside the Rajasthan Assembly. Two Congress MLAs, Shimla Devi Naik and Geeta Barwar, accused the speaker of violating their privacy. Their charge: two high-resolution cameras had been installed above the opposition benches. They argued the cameras were not just for safety. They were positioned so even private conversations could be recorded, sometimes when the House wasn't even in session. The speaker defended the move, calling it routine security upgrade. But the opposition insisted this was surveillance, not transparency. And suddenly, a debate about two cameras turned into a debate about the very soul of democracy. Think of the assembly for a moment. It is where dissent is supposed to echo, where opposition can challenge without fear, where heated debate, sharp, noisy, uncomfortable, is not a weakness, but the strength of democracy. But what happens when lawmakers feel watched? A raised eyebrow might be captured, a whispered aside recorded, a walkout or a protest frozen forever on tape. Fear seeps in and freedom shrinks. In this case, there are four values which are on trial. First is the privacy and dignity. In Puttaswamy judgment, the Supreme Court held that privacy is intrinsic to life and liberty. If lawmakers themselves lose privacy inside the assembly, what does it mean for citizens outside? The second value issue is trust in institutions. Democracy depends on trust. Government and opposition may fight bitterly, but they must believe the rules are fair. If one side feels secretly spied upon, the trust breaks. Now, the third issue is about transparency versus intimidation. A camera can be a tool of accountability, but can also be a tool of control. The same lens that protects can silence dissent. And lastly, the issue is of integrity of institutions. Assemblies must stand above partisan suspicion. If surveillance looks like one-sided, neutrality collapses. And when neutrality collapses, the institution itself loses moral authority. We saw the case, we saw the value violations. Let's see how people have argued from both sides. Let's start with the people who defend the cameras, and they point out, from a utilitarian lens, J.S. Mill might argue, if cameras prevent chaos and protect lives, the greatest good for greatest number outweighs the discomfort of a few. That's the first argument. Second, a social contract view. Hobbes and law remind us that we all surrender some liberty for collective security. Lawmakers too must accept oversight if it ensures order. And thirdly, there is an accountability argument. Cameras create record, they deter disorder, reduce false allegations, and reassure citizens that their representatives are not above scrutiny. Last up, Shoshana Zuboff warns the real danger is unregulated surveillance. She calls for democratic law and oversight. Applied here, cameras may be acceptable, maybe, but only with bipartisan oversight and clear safeguards. Now, these are the arguments given by the people who defend the cameras. Critics respond that surveillance inside the assembly undermines democracy at its very core. From a Kantian perspective, to monitor lawmakers without consent treats them as means to an end, not as dignified representatives of the people. Our courts, through the proportionality principle, remind us that restrictions on rights must be lawful, necessary, and least intrusive. Hidden surveillance inside legislature fails that test. Let's bring in Foucault here. He gives a warning that modern societies rely on disciplinary power, subtle control that works by making people feel constantly visible. Once people feel watched, they censor themselves, they hesitate, they conform. In legislature, that means debates may look more orderly, but it is order born of fear, not of conviction. And as Zainab Tofiki adds, constant surveillance doesn't monitor behavior, it reshapes identity. In politics, that reshaping means less dissent, less courage, less truth spoken aloud. So here's the dilemma that lingers in the assembly chamber. Should surveillance be accepted inside the very heart of democracy if it claims to promise safety and order? Or does such surveillance, by corroding dignity, trust, and freedom, weaken democracy itself? What would you decide? Do share your thoughts in the comments. Last month, newspapers reported that 3 policemen in Odisha were suspended after a man died in custody. Similarly, Supreme Court also pulled up the CBI for delays in investigating custodial abuse. Why is it, the court asked, the most basic reports are still pending? And across states, medical legal records reveal injuries consistent with beatings in custody. Each story raised the same haunting question. When the state takes citizens into custody, is it accepting responsibility to protect them or claiming a license to break them? Think about what custody really means. It means the state has taken charge of a life. It means protection under the law, not exposure to cruelty. But when someone dies in custody, the state itself becomes a violator. Order may be maintained on the street, but inside the lockup, justice collapses. In custodial torture cases, 3 ethical issues stand out. The first is the issue of human dignity. Kant argued that human beings must always be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means to an end. Custodial torture directly violates this principle. It reduces a person to an object, a body to be broken for information, a tool to achieve results. When the state treats citizens in this way, it is not simply committing violence, it's stripping away the very dignity that makes us human. The second issue is ends versus means. Police often defend third-degree methods by pointing to results: a confession extracted, a crime prevented, even lives saved. But Mahatma Gandhi reminded us that means and ends are inseparable. They say means are after all means. I would say means are after all everything. If justice is pursued through unjust methods, the outcome itself is poisoned. A confession obtained through fear is not truth. A crime prevented through cruelty leaves society brutalized. And the third issue is abuse of power. The police are entrusted with extraordinary authority to detain, to interrogate, even to use force. But that authority is legitimate only when exercised within law and morality. Hannah Arendt, in a study of the banality of evil, warned us that great wrongs are often committed not by monsters but by ordinary officials who stop thinking about moral weight of their actions. Custodial torture is precisely that. Cruelty disguised as routine duty, power stripped of conscience. The defenders of harsh custodial methods argue in 3 ways. First up is consequentialism. They claim if beating a suspect saves lives, then outcome justifies the method. David Bailey, who studied policing system worldwide, observed how pressure for quick results often drives officers to shortcuts. Success is measured in arrests, solved cases, and public applause. Under that pressure, torture begins to feel like a necessary evil. Second up is the professional pressure. John Kleinig, in his work on police ethics, described what he called the dirty Harry problem. Officers sometimes feel trapped, either break the rules to get results or let harm occur by sticking to procedure. In that mindset, the law itself feels like a barrier to justice. Torture becomes rationalized as the only way to get the job done. Lastly, the cultural imagery of policing. Peter K. Manning, in his studies of police culture, showed how institutional identity shapes practice, and the popular warrior cop image, widely associated with Radley Balco, has further normalized aggression and strength. From films to folklore, the tough officer who bends rules to protect the public is portrayed as heroic. Within this culture, harshness is not seen as abuse at all, but as proof of loyalty, strength, and even masculinity. But the case against custodial torture is overwhelming. The first is the rule of law. The state cannot break its own laws in order to enforce them. To do so is to destroy the very legitimacy. A government that tolerates torture is not protecting justice, it's corroding it from within. Secondly, the ethic of virtue. Policing is not meant to display cruelty, but restraint. True professionalism lies in self-control, the ability to use power firmly but without abandoning humanity. The strength of the state is measured not by how hard it can strike, but how fairly it can wield force. Thirdly, obedience and abuse. Stanley Milgram's famous experiments revealed how ordinary individuals, when instructed by authority, were willing to inflict what they believed were lethal shocks. They did so not out of hatred, but because they felt they had no choice. Custodial torture reflects the same danger. Officers stop seeing themselves as moral agents. They become instruments of a culture that normalizes cruelty. And finally, rights as principles. Ronald Dworkin argued that rights are not policies to be balanced against convenience. They are principles that must hold firm even under pressure. The right to dignity and life cannot be suspended to make policing easier. If those rights are negotiable, then justice itself collapses. So here's the dilemma. Can torture ever be justified in the name of safety and order? Or does it destroy the very justice it claims to defend, turning guardians of law into violators of it? Do share your thoughts. Last month, newspapers reported that Nestle's CEO had resigned. The reason? A relationship with a junior employee. The company insisted that this was not just a personal matter, it was about conflict of interest, breach of trust, and the culture it signaled inside one of the world's largest food corporations. This episode did not happen in isolation. From harassment claims in tech firms to conflict of interest in pharma, business headlines increasingly ask the same question. When leaders blur the line between private life and public duty, is it simply a lapse of judgment or a failure of ethics? Think about the role of a corporate leader. A CEO controls thousands of jobs, billions in investment, and trust of shareholders and consumers. So when the leader hides a relationship with a subordinate, is it just a personal choice, or does it become a public failure of responsibility? The Nestle's case forces us to confront this tension. Where does private morality end and public ethics begin? There are three major ethical concerns in the Nestle's case. First up is the conflict of interest. Philosopher Michael Davis defines conflict of interest as a situation where professional judgment is compromised or appears compromised because of personal ties. In corporate governance, even perception of bias can be fatal. If employees believe the CEO is favoring a partner, trust in promotions, evaluations, and leadership decisions erodes completely. And once the trust is lost, performance cannot restore it. The second concern is fairness and power imbalance. Philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote about dependence and freedom, warning that in unequal relationships, consent is often compromised. In a workplace, especially between CEO and a junior employee, power is never equal. A yes may not truly be free when careers and opportunities depend on it. For colleagues, fairness is distorted. Success appears linked not to merit but to proximity to power. Third, corporate responsibility. Business ethicist Thomas Donaldson argues that corporations are not just profit machines, they are moral agents with obligations to fairness, transparency, and respect. Leaders, therefore, are the custodians of those values. A lapse in judgment at the very top is never only personal. It sends a signal that ethics are negotiable and it drains the moral capital of the entire organization. Defenders of Nestle's CEO usually raise 3 points. First up is privacy. They argue that leaders are entitled to personal lives just like any other employee. As long as a relationship is consensual, it should remain private, separate from professional responsibilities. Secondly, performance first. Supporters often argue that what matters most is results. If a CEO delivers growth and shareholder value, personal missteps should not outweigh professional achievements. Milton Friedman famously argued that the sole social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. For him, the CEO is an employee of shareholders, not a custodian of social welfare. What the executive does in private life is their own affair. Thirdly, changing norms. Workplace relationships are increasingly common in global corporations. To hold a CEO to stricter standards than others, they argue, is double standard. Unfair in an age where personal and professional lives often intersect. But the case against is far stronger. The first issue is trust and legitimacy. Leadership rests on moral credibility. Ethicist Joanne Sewler describes leadership as a web of relationships with employees, investors, and the public. If secrecy or conflicts of interest weaken that web, legitimacy collapses, even if financial performance looks strong. Second up is the culture and example. Philosopher Cecilia Borg, writing on lying and secrecy, showed how the conduct of leaders create climates of permission. If misconduct is tolerated at the top, it normalizes double standards across the workplace. What leaders excuse in themselves, they cannot credibly forbid in others. Third issue is stewardship and responsibility. Thomas Donaldson and Patricia Verhan argue that corporations are embedded in society and owe duties beyond profit making. CEOs are not just managers of money, they're trustees of values. When they falter, the damage goes beyond quarterly earnings. It corrodes employee morale, investor confidence, and public trust in business itself. That is why ethical case against such misconduct is not marginal, it is decisive. So here is the dilemma. Should we judge corporate leaders only by performance, or must we hold them to higher ethical standards? Because they shape not just profits, but cultures of fairness and trust. Do share your thoughts in the comments. 3 stories, 3 different worlds: politics, policing, and business. But one question ties them together. What happens when power forgets ethics? Surveillance cameras that erode trust. Custodial torture that corrodes justice. Corporate lapses that drain legitimacy. They're not just headlines, they're reminders that ethics is never abstract. It is lived in parliaments, in police stations, in boardrooms. The real test is simple. Do our institutions protect dignity, fairness, and trust? Or do they sacrifice them in the name of control, convenience, and profit? And that question ultimately is one we must all answer. So long, happy learning.